Electric vehicles are showing up more and more in everybody's driveways. And so the question arises, how do we get those charged? And there are all sorts of challenges associated with doing this on a bigger scale, and we're currently doing it. And we're going to talk to Brendan McEwen, who is the Director of Electric Mobility and Low Carbon Strategies at AES Engineering in Vancouver. So welcome to the interview, Brendan.
Thanks so much, Markham. Great to be here.
So look, why don't you give us a bit of an overview of the issue, if you wouldn't mind?
Sure. So basically, when we're looking at how are we going to support widespread uptake of EV charging, it's important to think about where people are going to charge. So while we certainly need publicly accessible charging infrastructure where any member of the public can go and charge up, we also need to think about providing EV charging in other contexts. So most of the charging, I think in Canada, it's well over 70% of all the charging that takes place. And in some places, 90+% of all charging happens at home. And then there's also a significant chunk of charging that happens at workplaces. And then a relatively small bit, maybe 15 or 10% that happens when people are out and about and on the go. So with communities in BC, I think we've been leaders in thinking about how do we make large proportions or all parking in certainly new construction EV ready. So allowing for any household that lives in a multifamily building as well as single family homes, the ability to provide charging if they're provided with on-site parking so that they're able to charge at home. And likewise, we're increasingly leading in providing access to EV ready parking in existing buildings and doing comprehensive upgrades to existing multifamily buildings to make all parking EV ready.
Now, one of the things that I've discovered in interviewing battery experts is that electric vehicle batteries are going to be changing in the next 3 to 5 years, let's say. So we'll have solid state and we'll have much faster charging rates than we currently do. So it's one thing to charge your 2017 Nissan Leaf in your condo. It might be quite another thing to charge your 2025 Tesla, which would have different requirements. Are we thinking ahead to the technology getting better and faster and so on?
Yeah, I think we are. That 2025 Tesla, it's wonderful news that those things will be able to charge quickly. So when you're out on a road trip, you're trying to get a quick top up when you're out and about within a community, or for people who don't have access to home charging, then it's great that those vehicles will be able to charge faster if you can get a very fast charging station. I think still in terms of the cost of providing that infrastructure to all these vehicles, it's going to make sense for those households that have the ability to be charging, even those vehicles that can charge very quickly, to charge at a relatively slow rate overnight, because you don't always need to be charging quickly, and it's quite expensive to be able to provide the type of infrastructure like a 400 kilowatt charger that would actually be able to provide the rate of charge that those solid state vehicles will be able to provide, relative to infrastructure where you're charging at a relatively slow rate, let's say with energy management systems sharing across a level 2 circuit. You can still provide everyone with all the power they're going to need for their typical driving patterns with a slow overnight charge, and everyone will be recharged in the morning. So I still think that'll be certainly the lowest cost, as well as I would say the most convenient form of charging. It takes 3 seconds when you get home to just plug in on a nightly basis and be able to charge up.
And what are the infrastructure challenges, the regulatory challenges between new build construction and retrofitting existing buildings?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's always going to be easiest to make multifamily buildings, as well as workplaces and all sorts of other types of buildings, EV ready at the time of new construction. So what's happened with a number of Canadian cities, mainly here in BC, although we're seeing others around the country start to seriously explore and plan to implement these sorts of requirements, is saying that in new construction, as a requirement of this building being constructed, all residential parking spaces have to be made EV ready, which means everyone has to have an electrical outlet adjacent to the parking space capable of providing level 2 charging. And you're allowed to use EV energy management systems to design for load sharing, so that can significantly reduce the cost of providing that infrastructure in new construction, while still providing a good quality of charge. So again, like we were just discussing, everyone's able to charge overnight. So it makes a lot of sense to do that in new construction, and it would seem like local governments have the authority to do that. I think there's also plenty of room to have those sorts of requirements established at provincial scales or state scales in the US, and then ultimately have them in model national codes. So in terms of the regulatory frameworks right now, we're seeing them as local requirements. And then ultimately, I think it makes sense to have sort of more consistent types of requirements applied at a provincial or federal level. Regulatory barriers that I guess could stand in the way of this type of thing being adopted. Firstly, you need to ensure that a condominium association or a rental building owner is allowed to effectively resell power to those drivers. And there can be some kind of anachronistic components of just the legislation governing condos and rental buildings that could provide barriers to that, either in kind of utility commission acts in different provinces or in sort of relevant legislation around condominium governance. So those things I think are fairly easily rectified once provinces just realize like, hey, we need to update our legislation to deal with these new realities. So those would be, I'd say, the main issues that could provide some stumbling blocks, but here in BC, we've rectified those issues.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Now, a question I get asked quite often is, will the utility, basically the electricity distribution system in neighborhoods, be up to the challenge of allowing, being able to handle everybody having one or two EVs in their garage charging overnight?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Without energy management systems of some form, I think we're likely to see challenges sooner than if we do have energy management systems in place, especially when you get into the distribution systems. If everyone's just charging with no sort of control or sense of timing or coordinating with your neighbors in terms of when they're charging, then you can start to have greater peak power demands and would need to upgrade those local distribution systems on a faster basis. So I think what we're seeing utilities all around the world increasingly look into is how can we provide incentives or some sort of inducement in terms of how we structure our utility rates, what types of incentive programs we're offering customers to be able to shift when they're charging their vehicles. EV energy management systems are going to be a really key part of doing this at scale that could respond to time of use rates so that you're throttling down your charging when power is more expensive, or even receive signals from the grid operator to say, hey, we're close to capacity either on the local system right now, or wholesale power prices are relatively expensive, throttle down for the next hour. And you can still, again, be able to provide completely adequate charging services for overnight charging when you're doing that kind of demand response.
Right. And so do I understand this correctly, that the EV management system is built into the car and or the charger, or is this something that the utility has to do?
When I'm referring to it mainly as something that's built into the charging stations. Now that interaction with the grid, there would need to be kind of proactive actions taken by the utility in one way or another to ensure that they're seeing those customers, that EV load responding in the way they want to see it. So again, kind of the two high level categories of ways you could do that is one, some sort of way of changing your utility rates. So you're providing the right incentives for people to minimize how much power they're consuming at certain times. You make it more expensive when power prices are expensive or when the local grid is congested. And or there's also systems where utilities can communicate, let's say, to a multifamily building, and the energy management system that's working with that building to say the local distribution system is congested right now, throttle down your consumption a bit, and then who's ever, a company that's managing the charging for that whole building would be anticipating that this is coming, have something laid out in the contracts with the drivers in those buildings and say, hey, we're going to give you a better rate for charging, lower cost if we're able to throttle down your consumption for these couple of hours. So I think, there's a variety of ways this could evolve into the future, and different utilities and different charging service providers will deploy it in somewhat different ways, but broadly to mitigate those impacts and kind of delay or defer forever the grid upgrades that would need to happen. We'll see more and more action to get that sort of demand response out of vehicles.
Right. And final question, Brendan. My take on this, I've interviewed many experts on electric vehicles and some of the issues we're talking about here with utilities, is that there is a flood of technology that's already begun that will enable all of this. And utilities are, they're kind of grappling with how they're going to roll out that technology. Some are more advanced than others, but the technology, whether it's artificial learning or artificial intelligence, machine learning, digital technologies of some sort, but that's going to be the key to making all of this work. Is that a correct statement?
Broadly, yes, it is. It's a really exciting time to be sort of thinking and in this space. And yeah, there's all sorts of new technologies and just sort of new ways of bringing these technologies that are being developed right now to market, and ways of operating either programs or services for people who are doing EV charging in a multifamily building, in a workplace, and at home, to provide for that kind of grid response.
Brendan, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Hey, you're welcome.